Welcome, episode 1, Life to the Full podcast. Chris Cipollone.
Steve McAlpine.
Welcome, Steve.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. This is a new podcast. It's part of a new ministry, also of the same name, Life to the Full. I'm excited about it. Hopefully, Steve, you're excited about it. We're here, so we have to be excited about it. But
Well,
that's
you can
okay.
smell the paint in the room, so it's new everything. The paint hasn't gone dry on Life to the Full yet.
It better not have, because I was here until 11 p.m. last night setting up this studio. So there we go.
Yeah.
Life to the Full is, as I said, a new ministry. I suppose it's been a bit of a brainchild of mine for a long time, but something that God had to open the doors for. We'll go into that a little bit more later. But I suppose for our audience, the way that I think of this podcast that we're doing, and I've said to you, Steve, I would describe it as emotionally intelligent, practical theology. What I mean by that is I want the conversations of this podcast to be about things that everyday people are wrestling with literally in the everyday, things that matter, things that are not up in the clouds that preachers love talking about but are not connecting with people. But as I said, I don't want to just do it from a theological perspective. That's important. I want to do it from a pastoral perspective as well, because that is part of what Life to the Full as a ministry is seeking to be. We are bringing together Christian practitioners of many disciplines, most notably in the clinical psychological space, but also in the relationship counseling space, to be hopefully that emotionally intelligent, that we have truths that underpin us and we hold to those truths, but we don't want to do it in a dogmatic, militant way that fails to acknowledge that life can be messy for people. And part of that is a journey of seeking out what is the wisdom of God.
Yeah, and churches can, and historically have been able, have perhaps erred one way or the other, which was we'll do everything on the psychological, or we'll do nothing.
Yeah.
And how do you manage to say, well, there's practitioners who are have a good framework who we can work with, but we don't outsource pastoral care fully to a psychological clinic. There's a marriage between the two somewhere, and I think that's critical.
Yeah, and that is really the underpinning. We'll talk about that again in the episode, but something I learned about you, Steve, is that your wife is a clinical psychologist.
Yes. It's been interesting being in full-time ministry for a long period of time with a clinical psychologist wife. And I was talking to some young church planters yesterday who asked me, some of them are doing pastoral care, how does your wife navigate that space? Is it just a lineup at the end of a service for people who want, free clinical counselling?
Yeah.
That's $250 for 50 minutes. Thank you very much. Or is it you park it at the side? And it's a funny hybrid. Jill's very clinically aware, but also psychologically aware, emotionally intelligent, and she's been working as the wife of someone who's been in pastoral ministry. So we do things as a team. So it's a funny grey space for Jill. And the other thing for her as a clinician, her week landing on a Friday, and then Sunday it's a coming, and that busyness. So there's all those things for clinicians to think about as well, and that could be something down the line that would be worth talking about. How do you separate those spaces for people in the clinical setting?
Yeah. I've been reflecting on what is it about psychology that has that overlap. When we've been building out what is now Life to the Full, what practitioners and what disciplines do we bring into this infrastructure? And psychology seemed to be front and center. And reflecting on that, it is in its nature a talk-based practice. So what is it about a Christian what is it about psychology that feels potentially able to be spoken more of a Christian worldview as opposed to, say, a GP? Or maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe that's bad theology for me to say.
Yeah. Well, GPs even today would say they've learned to be more holistic about things. Even your physiotherapists are much more mentally attuned to what's going on with your body. I found that involved in going to see physios for certain things, injuries, and or perceived injuries, or the level of pain. All these sorts of things are coming into the psychological framework, and it's a therapeutic culture. So there's that to navigate, and it's a psychological age.
Yeah.
How do you do that well in church without dialing down your theology, or without, in fear, clamping your theology over the top and pushing stuff down?
Which I think is the bigger risk in it's the...
Our sphere it is, I
think. So theologically, I have no problem with echoing the words of Jesus, love the Lord your God, how? With all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. We are a whole person. And one of the reasons we've wanted to start Life to the Full is the belief that in our clinical settings, but also sometimes in our church settings, we splice the self. So the church is just about
dualistic.
the spirit.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
It's
very
dualistic.
Yeah. And so how do you do that well? That is a goal. But then how do you do it in a way where you don't and I'll explain this word, syncretistic is the fear. So how do you not just add a little bit of God onto what we have with our secular
Yeah.
theologies?
And it's interesting. Jill would be a great guest to have on here. Better looking McAlpine than this one, right? And she's very savvy on navigating that space. So she teaches at theological level, and she's got a practice which sees 50% non-Christian, 50% Christian.
Right.
And how do you do it well without dialing down the biblical framework
Yeah.
and without co-opting it or subverting it only to a psychological age? Or how do you do it without just, well, that's a sin issue. You go,
Yeah.
hang on, there's a brokenness issue here to go along with it. I think those two things are critical. What is a rebellion against God and what is part of the general rebellion by creation against God that results in brokenness and family systems issues and all those sorts of things. I think that's critical.
Yeah, that's great. So we're here. As
Yeah.
I said, this has been really the culmination of probably a 10-year journey for me. So I thought the way we might frame up this episode is to talk about what are we doing here? We've already alluded to a lot, but perhaps for you to ask me some questions as the relative newcomer on the scene
Yeah.
in terms of life to the full, not in terms of Christianity. You are my elder statesman, brother.
I'm becoming the elder everything to people these days.
So yeah, when I first introduced you to this concept,
Yeah.
what got you about it?
Well, because I thought it was integrating things well, and then I heard a little bit about you, and I knew that you wrote a book about this issue, the good book. So you're ticking all the. I'm running the gloriometer over you to see does Chris Cipollone fit the framework, and so down,
not
out.
out. Yep.
Well, that's a critical. That statement itself. The book title says a lot, right? So I'd be wanting to know from you, how did you get to that book?
Right.
You've got a theological framework and training.
Yep.
And you write a book for the Good Book Company
Yep.
called Down, Not Out
Yep.
that taps into this. Tell me a little bit about
Sure.
the last, I don't know, how many years you've been, how many years have you been an adult? I ask people that these days.
How
'cause
many
I
years
don't
have I
know.
been an adult?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. I think I was born as a 21-year-old actually.
right,
I was a
yeah.
man-child in high school. I joked that I never wanted a girlfriend. I just wanted to go straight to a wife. So that was but how long have I been an adult? Well, I guess by the strictest definition, I've just turned 40. Mm-hmm. So I guess that makes me 22 years.
22 years adult, yeah.
How long have you been an adult, Steve?
Oh, I've just turned 57.
Okay.
So 7 years.
Okay. So look, Down Not Out was published in 2017. The subtitle, the strapline of that book is Depression, Anxiety, and the Difference Jesus Makes. And one of the big theses of the book was that I'm not here to pit psychology against theology, but if we do psychology without theology, then we're missing a big part of the puzzle. That came out of a personal story. So, and I've shared this on other podcasts and different media resources, but the long story short is I was first diagnosed with depression at age 25. At age 28, I went to Bible college and a 3-year degree, Masters of Divinity, culminating in a job offer at the start of my final year. But I was given a deadline of September that year. So job offer January 2014, deadline to accept the job September 2014, which then led to 9 months of extreme rumination about which way that I should go in ministry.
A spiral?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And it had been a while coming. There'd been warning signs already, but that year was torture, to be honest with you. I had been a primary school teacher before, and so my plan, in a human sense, had been to become a school chaplain, which made sense. So the 9 months of 2014 continued. I spiraled. My deadline for the job was the 19th of September of that year. And the 2 days before that, 17th of September, waiting on, and I've never done this before, and I don't think I've done it again, waiting on the lightning bolt from God. Give me a sign. What do you want me to do?
Fleeces.
Right, exactly. No sign came. Absolute pit of despair. Had already been seeing a psychologist on medication, and I went home to my wife and said, I think I need more help. That then led to a voluntary hospitalization. And the irony being that the day I was meant to take the job was the day I actually walked into hospital and said, I can't take the job.
That's big. Imagine taking the job and 3 months later walking into hospital. Right. Yeah, you can see God might have kept you from something at that level.
Absolutely.
So that's interesting. So you walk into hospital. What happens next?
Right. The God moment happened actually. And I'm careful as I share this story because I don't want my message is not 7 steps to find your God moment.
Yeah.
That's not what I'm about. And actually, I've relapsed 2 years ago, and it was a very different experience. But if we come back to hospital, they basically drugged me up on the Friday with all sorts of sedatives to just get my body relaxed again. The Monday hit, and that was the first day of the program, and it was physical well-being session, essentially a gym session. The idea being physical fitness and mental health, which we can talk about in another episode too.
Oh, we sure will. You
Yeah.
know, as I say often, I'm a runner, but you won't have to ask me if I'm a runner. But physical, that's interesting. Did they identify that, or is that
Yes, that was part of the program.
yeah?
Problem is, I just worked my way into such a lather, both in that session, but also I think it was just in the lead up. I passed out in the gym session. They dragged me into the hospital floor. It was an outside session, and I came to consciousness with doctors and psychiatrists looking over me, and it was just this really almost an out of body moment of going. And I remember vividly, it was not who am I, it was what am I. I wasn't even a who anymore. It was just am I just a waste of space? Like, I'm a husband, I'm a father of 2 kids. I'm meant to be a master of divinity at this point, or at least 6 weeks from it. And I'm on the floor of a psychiatric hospital, like, excuse the Christian profanity, but what the hell? Like really, like what is going on? But in that moment came the God moment, which was the words of a song that we sing at church called Desert Song. And I look at that ironically going, again, I've just been at Bible college, but it wasn't the words of scripture. It was the words of a song, which is, anyway. And the line was, all of my life in every season, you are still God. I have a reason to sing. I have a reason to worship. And particularly that line, in every season, because let's face it, a hospital floor is a season.
Yeah.
And it's a very painful one. And yet God was still God. And then came a scripture, which was 1 John chapter 3, see what great love the Father has for us, that we should be called children of God. And that is what we are. And I think those two moments being the God moments was God saying to me, you are not any of these constructed identities, including the pastor. You're not first and foremost a pastor. You're not even first and foremost a husband and a father. I want to do all of those things well, still to this day. So I'm not saying I'm going to drop the ball on them. But when the rubber really hits the road, the reason you're not a what in hospital, but you're still a who, is because of your God-given identity as a child of God.
Yeah, that's a great framework, because I think one of the things we want to do going forward in a theological framework is that provides such good safety rail parameters for people, even in the midst of the dark times.
Yeah.
And it's interesting we think about it as a modern malaise. Charles Spurgeon, deeply troubled by
Melancholy, he used to call it.
Yeah, yet he the heights of, you think of Spurgeon, and then the lows that he had.
Yeah.
That his own church would send him off to France for 3 months to recuperate.
I didn't know that.
Yes,
Okay.
they would. I should have asked for that. Seen how,
Yeah, that's right.
But they recognised it.
Yeah.
Right, and that's an interesting take theologically. And in one sense, you also want to say that it's not modern in the sense that the Puritans had the understanding of the interior life, probably perhaps a little better than we've had in the last 200 years of modern life. I think so. That's been interesting.
Yeah.
And so did you come out of it? You came out of it.
Yeah,
clearly,
I mean that was a powerful moment on the floor right
Yeah.
there, and that's where the book starts, Down Not Out. But I'd always dreamed of being an author. That had always been a goal of mine. But at that point, when I was in hospital, what I did was think, okay, I can see the irony of this whole situation. Again, that I'm meant to be a master of theology, and yet my world is coming apart. In theory, what are the theological paradigms I've just learned over the last 3 years that even if I'm not feeling it to this degree, and again, there's another episode there about the role of feelings, but even if I'm not feeling it, what would I say to somebody else who I was trying to pastor in this situation? What are the theological paradigms at play? Again, one of them being identity. And I think the other one is really the role of suffering. One of the big hopes of Life to the Full for me is to help people see that the gospel, it is not stoicism. So when we suffer, texts like the Psalms show us that we are absolutely right to cry out and grieve and lament. So it's not stoicism, but it's also not fatalism. It's not to say that life ceases to have purpose.
Yes.
And actually some of the best work that God does is in the darkness.
Look, I think that's a critical issue about when I thought about Life to the Full and being involved was we're living in a culture that does not have a parking space for suffering.
Yeah.
It does not know. I live in a city that doesn't have a parking space for everything now in Sydney, I've decided. But you're looking around for, where do I put my suffering?
Yeah.
There's nowhere for it. I'm suffering towards the end of life. So let's just get a suicide pod and do ourselves in at an age where there's no meaning in life. And it feels like there's no category for suffering in this current context. So when people do suffer, they are either going to denial or absolute despair.
Yes.
And what is the job of the pastoral person to walk someone through suffering that they aren't exactly going through? This is because I think part of the pastoral concern is, well, I haven't suffered like they have. How can I speak to them? But that's not true, not according to the pastoral framework or according to Scripture.
Why is it not true?
That I think you can still have deep meaning, and you can still have deep feeling and empathy with someone, even if you haven't experienced the same things that they've experienced.
But my understanding of empathy is that you can't, by the strictest, because you haven't been through it.
I think when I look at people who are suffering, and we've talked about some of those issues today, and the kind of chill I feel about some of those terrible, that's not good. How can I get alongside this person?
Right.
And perhaps technically sympathy, empathy, all those sorts of things. This is where Jill and I have these discussions all the time. So how does she navigate that space, sitting in the space with someone who is suffering? How do you sit above it, but kind of not within it, but alongside?
Yes.
And for Jill, and then 50 minutes later, you're taking on the next one, and then the next one. So I think pastoral care has to navigate that space well without outsourcing everything and without trying to do everything. And that's part of what I liked about what you're saying.
I like that. Without outsourcing, I think good parachurches, if we can put it that way, sit in conjunction with our local churches, and that's what I want us to be.
Yeah, and I think that's critical.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so you came out of it.
Right.
How did that look reconstructing?
I ended up taking the job at church after all.
You did take it.
I did.
And they were happy for you to take it.
Very gracious, very, very gracious. As it happened, the senior pastor at the time told me he'd been the pastor for 22 years at the church, that he was moving on. So the whole church was in a bit of flux at that point. And so what happened was we put a term-by-term arrangement together. Do term one, see how you go. Do term two. There's a lot of wisdom there, I think. And term by term turned into about 10 years at that church.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
So that being 2014, those journaling musings turned into the book with the Good Book Company, which was published in 2017, which I would say is part biographical, part theological. I don't just want to speak theory. I want to share my life. And since 2017, I've been doing the itinerant thing in the mental health faith integration, which has now made way for what is now Life to the Full, which has always seemed like a logical next step. But the mechanisms to do that have been vague as to how we would do it. But through the very, very generous seed funding of a local church here in Sydney, here we are. And we're not for profit. I would describe us as, faith-based professional help. Relationship counsellors. We have a sexologist. There's a conversation for a good podcast.
Well, it is, and I think one of the things you said when we were talking about Life to the Full a few months ago was it's the disconnection now from the worldview of the Christian framework is so far removed from the cultural one that sexology and psychology's frameworks just seem so far apart. Without trying to just do co-opt, the world or just ignore it.
Yeah.
Navigating that space is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
So.
And we've done a lot of due diligence on what can we ethically offer. That's been really important to us. I suppose, to use a theological paradigm, how do we pay taxes to Caesar in what we're doing?
Yeah, and how do you not get on the front page of the Sydney Morning Herald for doing something
that's also true.
You see those issues coming up, right?
And we don't want to be that.
Yeah.
And we weren't willing to cross our fingers knowing that that's what we were doing. So the heart, from a best practice standpoint, the heart of what we offer is client-led therapy. In other words, if a client discloses that the Christian faith is important to them, then we can offer a level of support where the person on the other side of the room shares that faith. If the person does not disclose faith, then we can still operate and would love to still offer our services to someone not of faith. without crossing those boundaries should it not be something that the person wants to go to.
Yeah, Jill and I talked about that too, where 50% of the clients would disclose and
Yep.
say, I am a person of faith, and can we bring that, why would you park that to the side?
Yep.
Whereas, ironically, Jill is saying that some very secular counselors just and don't know how to navigate that space at all.
Yep.
But at the same time, if she has people who don't disclose or are clearly not Christian, she sees her role as bringing order out of chaos.
Yeah.
So there's a new creation aspect and there's a creation aspect to this as well, right? That someone comes to you with all complexities of ideas that you think, well, Jesus could solve all this, but at a common grace understanding,
Yep.
I'm bringing order out of chaos. I'm helping you I'm helping you navigate the order out of the chaos.
Yeah.
I think that's critical.
I love it. Yeah, I think that's exactly the right paradigm, and to be there with people when they're wounded.
Yeah.
And to help bring some level of healing. I see this as a healing ministry in many ways.
Yeah.
And that's a loaded term in the Christian space, I know, but order out of chaos is a great way to put it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's a bit about my backstory. Tell us about you. I knew about you before meeting you. Turns out, I didn't know this at the time, we not only share the same publisher, but we share the same editor.
Yes, that's right.
Within that publisher. So we are the Katie Morgan fan club.
We are. We have a young editor who's a gun. Right?
She is.
Well,
She's. I don't mind Katie knowing this. I describe Katie as a smiling assassin.
Yes.
She is. She's lovely. She's British. She's so polite.
Yeah.
But she has a good vision for what she does, and she'll very graciously point you in different directions.
Yeah. And that's a plug to Katie that when I first met her, I thought, she seems impossibly young to be casting her gaze over my amazing work. And then she started to go, what about this? And I'm like, oh, I didn't see that. And she's exceptional. So,
she is.
Yeah, Book Company's been good to me in that sense as well.
Yeah.
So writing has come later. I mean, I started writing a blog while I was a pastor. Most of my ministry life has been pastoral ministry in churches.
Did you do anything before being a pastor?
I did a few years as a journalist,
Okay.
and then wandered around the UK, not doing much. I have a very successful twin brother, so and he was very successful.
Do we want to unpack this in the podcast?
We could unpack. That's going to say that there's therapy session right there. He lives in Sydney, actually. So it's been interesting being a twin, how that the psychology of being a twin growing up is very interesting. We could talk about family dynamics at another time and bring someone in to do that. Became a Christian young, pastoral ministry. And I was the arts guy, right? So you're always the creative, dark, gothic, The Cure, all that growing up, all those bands. But I never had any clinical depression.
Yeah.
Though in 2005-06, major burnout.
Okay.
In ministry, and I remember it. I remember it when it happened. It was the pressure of about 5 or 6 different things. Young family, Jill and I having a bit of pressure, some expectations at church, some expectations of non-Christian friends, and my own. Well, none of those in themselves will take you down, but your own sense of what you should be doing. And I remember preaching one Sunday, and as I came towards the end of the sermon, I heard something crack. I didn't. It was just the rubber band in my mind snapping as I was finishing my sermon. And it felt like, reference that no one understands anymore. Homer Simpson going across Springfield Gorge on
I'm going to make it.
I'm going to make it. And didn't make it. And I sat down and I was shaking and I was just in tears.
Wow.
And that was it for about 6 months to 12 months. And
when you say that was it, like you
that was my last
out?
sermon. Yeah, that was done at church. And I was in a fog for months. And I vaguely remember the day when I was standing on the back veranda of our house overlooking the city, which was down the hill. And I thought, what's that strange feeling? Oh, it's feeling happy. Yeah. Now, I went on medication lightly for a while, but not much. But it was the first time I've been deconstructed like that. Mm-hmm. And that was scary. You come back from that, a different person, I think. You walk with a limp, as they say, as the old Welsh preachers talk about that. Yep. And that was interesting because it gave me an insight that here I'm married to a psychologist and I'm theologically trained and educated and I know my stuff, and I just got broken by that.
You used a word there that really jumped out at me, which was should.
Yeah.
I was at a wellbeing seminar a couple of weeks ago with pastors in the room, and the guy led with the power of the word should, and it was almost this collective gasp because
Yeah.
not just for those of us in formal ministry, but I think all Christians wrestle with that
The
ethic of
shouldness.
should,
Yeah,
right?
they do.
And there is a rightness to that. There is an ethic with which Scripture sets out, and yet how do you do that in a way that doesn't put such blinding pressure on you that you get to that point? I don't have a great answer for that, but that's another conversation that we could have.
Yeah, the shouldness is a huge issue, I think. And so subsequently, I've had a few more hairy moments, health-wise, I think, more than anything. I'm do my own itinerant ministry stuff at the moment, writing, speaking, blogging, that sort of thing. And occasionally going back into churches, which I kind of miss sometimes
Yeah.
because I do miss the week in, week out pastoring and preaching
Yeah.
to a flock
Yeah.
and a people and sharing my life with them singularly as leading them.
Yes.
I miss that aspect of it and the day-to-day pastoral work.
Yeah.
I do miss that.
So do I, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And I think maybe at 57 I'd be a safer pastor to be around than at 37 when I knew everything and had everything sorted out.
Yeah.
And now I'm much more circumspect about something.
It's really funny you say that. On a personal journey. I still don't know where I'm going to land long term in this ministry. I'm stoked with what we're doing here.
Yeah.
Where do I fit within it? Time will tell. But I do wonder whether this is God preparing me later in life, actually.
Yeah. And I think as a 50-something-year-old,
almost 60.
You're almost 60. You are at your emotional, psychological superpowers if you've sorted things out at that age, which does make you a safer person to be around, I think.
Which reframes the narrative around ministry trajectories for sure.
100% does, yeah.
What's your hope for this podcast? What do you want this to do in the kingdom of God?
I'd like it to open up conversations for people. So at one level, I'd hope that we would be able to speak to professionals and senior leaders in churches and in parachurch organisations, but also in the allied health field, to get them thinking about what it means to integrate well the theology and the psychology, and also encourage them, because a lot of psychologists who are Christians are going, well, where's the field going? How do I navigate what seems to be a field in which, Trevin Wax for the Gospel Coalition said anthropology is the big issue at the moment. And what does it mean to be a human? How do we create, is meaning and purpose something we receive, or do we create it? All those things are in the mix. And the Australian Psychological Association now says we're looking for practice-based evidence, not just evidence-based practice.
What does that mean?
Now, that's interesting. I did ask my wife about that. She said evidence-based practice was we're going to be scientifically driven about what we do.
Yep.
And practice-based evidence is saying we're going to let the clients determine what the...
Interesting.
And she said it's a 180-degree
Wow.
turn. Not fully, they'll do both, but it is saying that the psychological field in the West is dialing down its commitment to science at one level, and is dialing up its commitment to how you feel you are.
Yes.
So there's a lot under the tip of that iceberg,
Yep.
Especially around identity and who decides who you truly are. You think about how you would navigate that 40 years ago as a clinician. You'd do it from evidence-based practice.
Yep.
The flip is practice-based evidence.
Fascinating. It's kind of
There's an
symptomatic.
episode in that.
Well, it's kind of I've never heard that before, but it makes me think that reflects the culture that we're in.
100%
the individual becoming self-actualization, I suppose.
It is the self-actualization issue, which then, I'd ask you this: if that becomes the default in the secular frame, that sort of pushes what we're doing here to the fore as being important for Christians to grasp.
Yeah, I think if I reframe self-actualization around you do you, I'm going to put my stake in the ground.
Yeah,
I think Christian leaders have, and I think we might be disagreeing on this. By the way, Steve, I should say I welcome disagreement on this podcast.
Do you? Well, I don't. So let's,
Good, we'll be friends.
Yeah.
I think you do you is not automatically a bad thing. I think we need to reframe it very carefully, though. I think where you do you represents something of common grace and wisdom is to say, if I overlay you do you with many parts, one body, that paradigm, there is something about each of us that are wired in different ways that God has made uniquely and wonderfully. Where I think we fall down is in brackets. When we say you do you, what we're actually saying is you do you for your own glory. I want to reframe that and say, actually, yes, you do you, but for God's glory. So there is a lordship paradigm that has to sit above the you do you phenomena that does not exist in culture that I think we can redeem in Christianity.
That's a very interesting take. And I think that's right, in the sense that the you do you has become unfettered
Yes.
from the Christian framework.
Yep.
So you look at the post-Christian framework, it's almost that Christianity taught the culture too well, that the individual is very important.
Yep.
Because the Bible says the individual is very important.
Yep.
Christ died for not generalized sinners, but you.
Yeah.
God created you, but you take the God and Christ bit out of that and
Yep.
you're unfettered. Very good. Nick Cave, the Australian singer, has a very good writing on his Red Hand Files blog today about what does freedom mean. And he, what does it mean to be free was the question that was asked, which is a big psychological question, right? And how he frames freedom within constraint.
Yes.
And he actually does it through spirituality. He said, I actually go to church because it constrains my freedom in such a way that leads me to grow.
Yes.
And you think, who would have ever thought Nick Cave would say that, right? But he says that. He said, marriage constrains my love in order for me to grow. And I thought, that's interesting because that's countercultural. So what I would want to hope that we would do is be countercultural in a way with what we're doing here.
Yes.
In such a way that it does show what life to the full looks like.
Yes.
Because life to the full, unfettered from Jesus' statement about life to the full. This is where we're going to get, perhaps.
Yeah, well, you're giving me a great segue into the next two episodes because as we've, it's always risky forming a whole ministry around not even one Bible verse. It's like half a Bible verse. That always feels like it's on. And yet what's interesting about the verse is it's an encompassing statement about life, right? It is everything in many ways. And so the automatic question that I've wanted to ask as a group, as a board, as a launch team, as with you, what is Jesus actually talking about when he offers life to the full? And what we'll actually see in the next episode is before we even get to the what, I think actually we need to look at the when, and we'll talk about that. So I might wrap it up there for this episode.
Yeah, that sounds like a very good segue, and it feels like it would keep me coming back.
Good. All right, well, tune in for the next episode. We will look at, again, not what is Jesus talking about with life to the full, but when is he talking about? Because when we answer that question, I think we can get to the what. So stay tuned.
It's going to be fun.
See ya.